Hi, I am medium and psychic Kim Moore, and I thought I would share with you my story about how I became a medium. So in 2004, I was pregnant with my fourth child with a man named Mike, and we had been together for 12 years at that point. At that point, he was also married to somebody else, but we were still kind of seeing each other. And in September of 2004, he attempted, well, actually, he did succeed in taking his life. He did that on September 2nd, 2004. He had shot himself. And then by September 12th, 2004, he passed away. This was my only long-term relationship that I had had at that point in my life. And it was absolutely devastating for me and my kids. And I was pregnant at the time with our fourth kid. So what happened is that on September 2nd, I went into labor in the morning. I was in the hospital. I was dilated. For any of you who have babies, you know how that goes. I was dilated and I was ready to deliver. And I called him and we talked on the phone for about 10 minutes. And he said he was coming to the hospital. And that was actually the last time that I spoke with him where I heard his voice. And so he said, hey, I've been sick. When he said I was sick, I knew what that meant. It meant that he had been trying to stop using a painkiller, and he was depressed, but he was also depressed because of a lot of other situations in his life. So he talked to me on the phone. He gave me phone numbers of his mom and his daughter, who I didn't have those numbers at the time. And he said, tell them I've been sick. And I said, well, aren't you coming to the hospital? And he said, yeah, I'll be there in just a few minutes. And that was the last time that I actually got to speak with him. And so that day, for some reason, my labor stopped. It just stopped, just halted. I didn't dilate anymore. And I was right at the part where they're like, hey, go home. And then maybe you can come back when the baby starts to move forward a little bit more. So I left and I went home and I was really upset because he never showed up. I called him a lot and he never answered, but I never went over there to go check on him or anything like that because I didn't think he would try to kill himself. So I was home and I was calling him and I had a really bad feeling all day long. And at 5:30 that night of September 2nd, I got a phone call from the Edgewater police asking if I knew someone named Mike. They said his last name, but I'm just not going to say it for the video. They asked if I knew him. I said yes. I asked immediately if he was still alive. And they said, how do you know him? And so I explained some of the situation. And so they told me that he had actually shot himself and that he was at the hospital. So I immediately went there after giving the police the phone numbers that he had given me earlier. I immediately went there. I don't know how I made it. I drove across town in rush hour traffic. And I was like crying in the car, and I was pregnant and my kids were at daycare and I had to try to arrange for my brother to pick them up. And it was really a very intense experience that thankfully I've never had again in my life. So I got there, and when I got there, he was in surgery. His family was there. His family did not know that I was pregnant with our fourth kid. They did know about the other ones. So when I got to the hospital, that was a little bit of a shock. He also has a giant family. They were all there as well. And they were doing a surgery on him. He ended up making it through the surgery. And so I left really fast, went home, took a shower, and came back. And they let me into his room, even though it was after visiting hours. So I went in there. I was with him that night after he got through his surgery. I went in there and held his hand. It was not easy. It was not an easy time. And he, at the time, had like paper bags on his hand. So I asked if we could take those off, and they said they had to wait to see if he would make it, because that's how they would test for gunpowder residue. So for the first couple of days he was there, he was not conscious. He was in a medicated coma, and he had these bags on his hand. So after that, after a couple days went by, and there was a lot going on at the hospital, as you can imagine, in this particular situation. And so it was just a hard time. But I found that all I wanted to do is sit with him and spend time with him. And I would talk to him. There were other people visiting. And so I was there with him a lot. And so was his family. And so was his wife. And so were the other people. He had 2 other kids besides the 3 that I had with him at the time. And I was very pregnant at the time. And so finally, on September 9th, or not finally, but on September 9th, which was the 12-year anniversary of us meeting, they said that he didn't wake up from his surgery. He had a surgery to put a feeding tube in. He never really regained consciousness after that. And so that was devastating in itself, and the timing of that was very interesting, especially since just a few days after that, he passed away on September 12th, which is 9/12. So I knew him within 12 hours of 12 years, and I met him on September 9th, which was the 9/9 kind of thing. So all those things I didn't think about at the time, but now in retrospect, I kind of look back and say, wow, there were a lot of freaking signs going on in my life, in my connection with him. But on September 9th, they said that they were putting him on a feeding tube. But since I didn't know that the surgery had gone wrong, I tried to go into work because I was a single mom. I didn't have anyone else to support me. So I went into work on September 9th in the morning for a couple of hours. And when I did, a friend of mine started talking to me about John Edwards. She said, oh, my girlfriend had a love of hers that died. And I said, oh, no, he's not dead. He'll make it. It's fine. And she's like, well, just so you know. So she kind of planted that seed in my head. But after that, I went to the hospital. That's when I found out that he didn't make it out of the feeding tube. A couple of days later, his mom decided to take him off life support, which I definitely think was the best decision. He would not have had vision. He would not have been able to do any of the things that he loved to do. And he had damaged his frontal lobe immensely. So at that time, that's what happened. And he was actually scheduled to be taken off life support on September 11th. But it ended up being at 1:57 a.m. on September 12th. And you'll understand the significance of that a little bit later on here as I explain this. So he passed away on September 12th. During the entire 10 days that had elapsed between September 2nd and September 12th, I never went back into labor. My labor never returned. Like, I was still at 2 centimeters dilated, and I was going through all of this with my son, Michael, who is a lot of you, anyone who's been to any of my classes or been to any of my events over the last 20 years of doing this, have met him most likely because he's grown up with me doing this. But at the time that his dad died, he wasn't born yet. And so he passed on September 12th. Our anniversary was on September 18th. His birthday was on September 6th. So there were a lot of events in September that were pretty significant. His funeral ended up being scheduled on September 24th. And on September 22nd, I delivered Michael. My first sign in all of this that Mike was still around was in the birth of my son. I had a couple of dreams about him prior to this, but they weren't really full dreams where I could say oh, I really talked to him. In both dreams, I had seen him and hugged him and talked to him a little, and they felt very real. But at the time, I was never I used to think John Edwards was full of it and that he got people's information before he did readings and stuff like that. So I was not really open to that and what she said about John Edwards, my friend at work. But I was talking to him out loud while I was in labor. I went into labor on September 21st at 6 a.m. I got to the hospital. They were going to induce me anyway. So I got to the hospital at that time, and he was my fourth kid, and I delivered him naturally. And so, as you guys know, like any women out there watching, like it takes less time the more kids you have. So I, though, was in labor all day, and I said to him, the only way that I would believe that he was around me, and I said this out loud, the only way I believe is he was around me is if Michael, who he didn't want to be named Michael. He wanted him to, our original plan was to name him David Michael. But I said, if he's born at the exact same minute, that would be the only way I would ever believe it. And he died at 1:57 a.m. on September 12th. So Michael, I was in labor all day into September 22nd, which is like 20 hours of labor. I had been in at that point 18 hours of labor, which is the longest labor I've had with any of my kids, including twins. And so it looked like he wasn't really ready to be born yet because he kept coming and going up and down, up and down, up and down till finally he was delivered. And during the whole process of me being in labor, I was crying. I was holding on to like a little piece of fabric that I had from his pants. My original doctor, who I had started to see at the beginning of my pregnancy, and then I switched doctors, he still served that hospital. He had come in, nurses had come in, they all knew what had happened. They all came, checked on me, told me they were so sorry about everything because that had just been 10 days ago. So it was a very like emotional, heavy time. My mom was there. My sister was there. I also had really bad bronchitis at the time. So it was a very difficult day. And so as the day progressed and the midwife was with me to help deliver my son, I told her the situation. I said I wanted to be born at 1:57 a.m. That's the only way I'll ever believe in this whole life after death kind of thing, or death after life, or whatever you want to call it. And so I look over at the clock, and at the clock on the hospital wall, it said it was 2:05 a.m. And to me, I thought in my head, oh, well, I guess that's close. But the midwife looked at me and she said, no, look behind you. And behind me on the birth clock, he was born at 1:58 a.m. And that made perfect sense to me because he didn't want him to be named after him. So why would he want him to die or be born at the same moment that he died? So I did end up naming him Michael, regardless of whether his dad wanted that or not. I figure, he dipped out, so I got to do what I want. So I named my son Michael. And then on the day of Michael's birth, Mike's obituary was printed in the paper. And then I was released from the hospital on September 23rd. And I took Michael and me went to his funeral on September 24th. So having a baby that's being introduced to his family at the day of his funeral it's a lot. There was a lot going on, and I definitely have to say I've been through a lot of shit in my life, but that was probably, I can honestly say that those were the worst moments of my life. There's a lot of interesting kind of things that happened because he died on the 2nd. Sorry, he took his life on the 2nd. He died on the 12th, and Michael was born on the 22nd. So there was some synchronicity there. The time was a synchronicity. At the funeral, I was driving in a separate car than my kids because my car had a car seat and they were with their grandparents and with his other kids and stuff in the limo. So I was driving separately. And a couple days, or actually the day before he actually shot himself, he was over in my house. I had come home and he was there and he was watching the movie The Silence of the Lambs. And he was joking around with me about it, and it was just the kind of jokes that he used to have. But anyway, it was a funny time. We were laughing, and it was the day before he did this, actually. And so I pull up to an intersection where I needed to make a left turn, and there's a median in the intersection. I'm in Colorado, and for any of you guys who know where Wadsworth and 285 is, that's where it was. I was turning left and going over to Fort Logan, but if you don't know, it's a median. And so right on the median, as I was driving and crying with my son in the back, going to his service, like not the service where they talked about him, but the service where they put him in the ground. As I was doing that, I looked over in the median, and all by itself, sitting in the median, was a book version of Silence of the Lambs. And at that moment of his funeral, I was like, that's really weird. And so that happened. We went to the service. We went to the post service, the reception. We went there, and that's when Michael met most of his family that day, because he was just born. He was only 2 days old, and so after that, I started to really give some of this stuff a second thought about, like, maybe he is around. And then I had a series of dreams. And the first dream I had started with just me hugging him in the hospital. The second dream was me walking up to a big wooden door, walking into a room where he was sitting on a couch watching TV, and there was some lady behind him hanging up clothes. And he looked at me and he was shocked to see me. And he said, "How did you find me?" And I said, well, they took me to find you. Like, everybody thinks you're dead. And he looked at me, and then he looked back at the TV, and what he was watching looked like Law and Order. That was his favorite show. That was kind of his favorite. That was his favorite. He was watching it on TV, but I felt like he was watching something else, because I said to him, I said, "Why are you so involved in this? You already saw this episode." And he looked at me very seriously and then looked away and looked back at the TV he was looking at. And so when he did that, I told him I wasn't leaving and that I was going to stay there with him. And he told me I had to go. And I said, "No, I'm not leaving. I'm staying with you." And so at that point, he said, "I promise you I will visit you again. You have to go now." So I left. And I was kind of like, I felt like I had to go. So I left, and I woke up, and there was that dream. And then a couple weeks later, I had a very different dream, which I always remember to this day. Even though it's been almost 20 years since he's died, I remember this dream like it happened yesterday. And in the dream, I was standing it was in a room, and I thought it was like a funeral home. And so I was there, and I walk over to a window, and I look out the window, and it looked like Fort Logan Cemetery, which is a military cemetery. They pretty much all look the same. So it's like grassy hills. There were no headstones, and this is where it gets a little weird, I saw a clown riding up to me on a unicycle, and he handed me a yellow flower, and he said, "Turn around." And I turned around, and Mike was there, and he looked well, and we sat and we talked. It felt like days, months that we were sitting on this couch talking. And I told him everything that happened in the hospital. I told him everything that had happened since he passed away. And he told me that he was doing okay. And when I woke up from that dream, I felt like I had a visit. So at that time, I decided I wanted to see a medium. And so I didn't, I looked up John Edwards, because that's the one that everybody knew at the time. I looked him up. I tried to get an appointment. It was like a 2-year wait list to get into an appointment 2 years from now. And that just really didn't work for me. So I was like, I don't know how I'm going to find a medium. He's the only one I know. And I thought mediums were all these famous people, and that you had to go to these famous people, and that would be the only way you would get to see a medium. So I was listening to the radio one morning when I was taking my kids to school. And as I was taking them to school, I heard a medium on the radio in Denver. And I was like, holy shit, there's a medium. I can call into the radio station. She said she'd be on at 7 o'clock again that night. So that night, I had my sister's block Nokia phone, which 2004, for any of you guys that know what those are, they're big and they're bulky. And I thought that if I used that phone, since it was my mom and sister's phone and not mine, nobody could trace me, nobody could know who I am or anything like that, because I was a skeptic. I was totally skeptical of the whole thing. And so I call into the radio station, finding out later that I was the first call in. And she asked me when I got on the phone, she just said, "What's your name?" I said, "Kim." She goes, "What's the name of the person you want to talk to?" I said, "Mike." And that was it. And then she put me on hold. And so I was on hold for like 20 minutes. I had my cassette recorder out so I could record it whenever it played on the radio. And so she finally answered the phone, or she finally got back on the line. And it was on Cozy 101 for any of you guys that live in Denver. I think it was like October 2004 when I did this. So he'd only been gone like a month and a half at that particular point. So at that moment, I call in, I'm waiting. She says, Mike. She tells me he's my, boyfriend. She says, he's there with his dog. She described his dog. She described a couple other things about him. And it didn't touch me right away, because I was like, yeah, well, that's all kind of whatever. Like, that's common stuff. So being a skeptic at heart, and I expect every single one of my clients to be a little skeptical, because if you're coming to see me or going to see any medium, you definitely don't want to like give them all your information, because that doesn't validate your intuition or your connection to them. So basically, she gets back on the radio, she tells me that stuff, and she's like, okay, he wants you to know that he loves you and he's okay. And so I was like, okay. And then she stopped and she said, wait a minute. She goes, you're his sweetheart. And she said that I had a kid after he was born and I named it after him. And that was what it took to touch my heart. And so she said that to me. I broke down crying on the phone. I knew that that was him, because there was no way that anyone knew that. That was never even the plan that that would be his name. And there wasn't like Facebook and all that kind of stuff at the time. So there was no way to look up any of that information. So I recorded it. I put it on a cassette tape. A couple of weeks later, I brought it to his mom. As you can imagine, she at the time might have had mixed feelings about me, but I get along with her quite well now. But I brought her a cassette tape and I said, hey, I don't know if you believe in this. I know I didn't, but I just want you to listen to this, and you can think whatever you want. I just want to give you the option to listen to this. So I left her with that cassette, and a couple weeks later, I said, think whatever you want. I just want you to see this, listen to this, experience it, whatever you think about it. And her response like a week later was, that was interesting. And that kind of started me getting connected with that aspect of mediumship. So what I started to do since I was home, and you guys, I got to tell you, this is probably one of the kindest things that anyone has ever done for me. At the time, I was a single mom. I had no money, and I have 4 kids now. And I had no PTO. I had no save time. Me and Mike had made a plan that he was going to take care of our kids and I was going to work, and that's what we were going to do. And that's not what happened. So I had all these kids, I had to feed them. I had people helping me, family members that had like given me some money so I could buy groceries and do stuff like that. But it wasn't going to sustain me for any extended period of time, especially since the fact that I was working full time. I had been working full time for years. So at that moment in time, it was really hard, and everybody I worked with knew the whole story. So they did something really kind of amazing. And to this day, it's one of those moments that just changes you. So this is just a reflection on how acts of kindness can affect other people. So what happened was and I worked at Tough Shed, so I highly recommend, if you want a shed, go to Tough Shed. At the time, that's where I worked. And so the people that I worked with in the main location had started collecting money for me to help me. The owner of Tough Shed and all the stores that are in different states and everything that I dealt with every day, because I was in accounting, he gave them permission to use their sick time and their vacation time to donate to me, so I had time off. So I ended up with 8 weeks off of work because everybody donated money and time to me so that I could heal. And that was the kindest thing that anyone's ever done. They gave away their time with their family, their time of taking a break from work, so that I would have time to just have my baby, have my life, and heal my own mind and body. And so that was a really wonderful thing that happened. So that allowed me the opportunity to do some research. So I started going to the library constantly, looking up all books about afterlife communication, understanding mediumship, how it worked, how I could do something like that. Because when she told me that I named that baby after him, and when that hit me right here in the center of my heart, I decided in that moment that that's what I want to do. Like, that's what I want to do with the rest of my life. Other people that felt as bad as I did, I wanted to be able to help them and help them heal and help them connect. So I came to mediumship through trauma. I find that people usually are kind of born with it, or they have some traumatic experience which leads them down that path. And so every book I read, from John Edwards to James Van Praagh to all the famous mediums that were out there, everything I read said you could do it yourself. So I took that to mean I could do it myself. And so I did all the research. I looked into like what there was available out there, if anyone could teach you that. And then the lady who had done the reading for me on the radio, she was teaching classes in Denver at the time. So I decided to start taking those classes. And when I started taking those classes, in retrospect, I realized they were really about me healing, but they were also about not just learning how to talk to dead people, but also psychic connections to my soul, understanding my life path, who I am, all of that. It was very therapeutic for me at the time. So I started taking those classes, and within probably like 4 months of taking those classes, I started to attempt doing readings for people. I started doing readings with people that I worked with. I had like an oracle deck. I started trying to connect with loved ones while I was taking the class, because I knew that's what I wanted to do. So often I would be like to my friends at work, hey, meet me in the fire escape. I want to practice doing a reading on you. I wasn't ashamed or shy about telling people that that's what I wanted to do. A lot of people over the years of teaching this have some level of shame or concern that if they do something like this, there's so many people around them that don't believe it, that they'll be judged, all of that. I didn't care. At that point, I'd been through the worst experience of my life, and I thought I can go through anything now. And I'd been through some shit at that point. But that was the worst time of my life, and I figured if I can make it through this, I can make it through anything. I can figure this out. I've always been like that. So I started doing readings, and I started getting pretty good at it. At the end of 2005, because the way you get good at it is to practice it and do it. So by the end of 2005, I started telling people that in February of 2006, I was going to do that for a living. That's what I was going to do. I was going to do that full time. That's how I was going to make that magic happen. So February rolled around, and guess what? I didn't have enough money to make that magic happen. But I lost my job on Valentine's Day of 2006. So I put it out there, and it came to me in an unexpected way. But by losing my job, what happened at that point is that it helped me kind of allow me to do this, because as a medium, you don't start off being busy all the time. I thought at the time, when I was charging like $60 an hour, that if I worked for 10 hours a week, that would be perfect and I would be able to pay all my bills. Well, when you start off as a medium, you don't usually do 10 hours a week. That took me a few years to get to that point. So I decided that this is what I wanted to do with my life, and I was going to pursue it no matter how I could do that. So I went back to school because I noticed that people needed help more so than just connecting with their loved ones. There's so much more to it than that. So in addition to going to school for mental health counseling, I also started counseling as well for myself to help better understand myself. So a lot of people who become mediums, it's not an easy thing to do. You got to work on yourself. You got to work on your connection with spirit. You got to trust your intuition. And you also have to be able to be vulnerable enough to sit in front of someone and say all this crazy stuff and have it make an impact. So I was on that path. And along the way, I thought, well, if that doesn't work, I'll just go be a counselor. If this doesn't work, I'll just do this. I had all these kind of backup plans. But any backup plans that I made as I was through school and everything kept pushing me back to being a medium. So I was working at a store. I was teaching classes. 2005, 2006 is when I got laid off. That's when I started doing all that. And since 2006, since Valentine's Day 2006, that is when I decided to follow my heart and do this for a living. So I was doing that. I was going to school. I was trying to figure out how to take care of my kids. I was raising 4 kids of my own, which isn't easy. Plus going to school, dealing with all my mental health stuff, and also, in addition to that, helping other people doing readings. So that's what I was doing, and I did that for years. So at the end of school, I did an internship at a nursing home. And I did the internship and then they hired me there. And so I worked there for a few months. And as I worked there, my business started to build so much so that I couldn't do that anymore. So it was just like the universe was kind of pushing me back into that direction. So like I said, it's not easy to become a medium and use that as your sole source of income, especially when you're a single mother of 4. So it was really hard for me to get over the poverty consciousness and to not worry about my bills and stuff like that and just trust that everything was going to be okay. During that time, did I worry? Hell yes. I worried every freaking day about money. I can't even say I don't still worry about that on occasion, but it's very different now. So at the time, that's kind of where I was at, taking care of my kids, going to school. And so one of my friends that I had taken classes with also did volunteer work at that nursing home. And he said to me that he had started to take mediumship classes at Arthur Findlay College, which is a big, it's like the Hogwarts for mediums in England. And I knew I wasn't going to be able to fly to England. I knew I couldn't afford that. But he said, look into it. So, and there was a woman that he took classes from on the East Coast. Her name was Janet Nahavik, and she's passed away right now. But she was an excellent medium. And so she had a church in New Jersey where you could go take a class there. She was teaching a class with John Holland. And that was my first mediumship class. So I flew to New York. I hadn't been back to New York in 26 years. That's where I was originally from. We had to move from there very suddenly when I was 13 because my mom's boyfriend tried to kill her. So me and all my siblings, we had to move out of state overnight. So I hadn't been able to afford to go back to where I was born and where I had lived for the first 13 years of my life until I took this class. So there's like a lot of parallels that happen in my story of becoming a medium, healing my own stuff from where I grew up and how I grew up and experiences with domestic violence and sexual abuse and emotional abuse and all that kind of stuff, having to leave my house. All those things when you're 13 are very traumatic. So I was going back home and dealing with all of that. And also back home was my dad, who I didn't know until I was 40. So I also got to go back home and spend time with my dad as well. I had met him at that point, but we hadn't got to spend a lot of significant time together. So I actually, when I flew to New York, I spent time with him. I was there with a really good friend of mine who also started doing readings at that metaphysical bookstore that I started at. So we went together, we took this class. It was John Holland and Janet Nahavik, and it was amazing. There's people I still talk to from that class. That was in 2014, and it was amazing. And that gave me kind of like a feeling of, okay, well, this is like the professional way of being a medium, not the way I had been doing it, which actually there's no professional way to do it. You just do it. But at the time I thought, well, these are the people who are really good at this. So that's what I should strive for. So I took those classes. I continued to take classes on the East Coast for quite some time over the years, probably like 5 years of that, back and forth with classes. I've met some amazing people through those classes. But what they did is they helped me refine my mediumship. It was already there, but it was very raw. So going and taking those classes helped kind of refine it, helped me really kind of step into the details. Because when I'd taken those original classes, it was more focused on me figuring me out and then being able to help other people with a clearer way of seeing things. So now I had gone to these classes, which were wonderful. I'd done those. I started to do fairs. I started to do fairs in, I think, 2007. I did street fairs. I did all kinds of things like that to kind of like help me grow as a medium. I forgot to mention this, but this is one of those other interesting signposts on the way that show me that Mike was kind of working with me to make this happen. So, and this is kind of a phenomenally crazy kind of story. So a lady came up to me at the People's Fair in Denver. It's a huge fair. She came up to me. She brought me a card. She said, hey, would you be interested in participating in Edgewater Days, which is a small suburb of Denver. And that was where Mike lived. And that's also where he died. And so I said, yeah, I would love to. So the fair ended up being right next to where his house was. And the placement of my booth ended up being a block away on the same street from where he shot himself. And so that wasn't coincidence enough, or that wasn't enough of a sign. The whole time I could see where he lived from where I was doing readings. But later on, the lady called me and we were talking about how I became a medium and what it took. And so I told her the story of Mike and what had happened. So Mike actually was not at his house. He shot himself in a gazebo that was 3 blocks from the Edgewater police station. And he shot himself there. There was a lady who called it in, and that's why he was able to live for 10 more days. So the lady I was talking to from the fair starts talking to me about this situation. She said, "When did that happen?" And I told her the date, and she started to get really quiet. And she said, "Where did that happen?" And I told her, and this was after she had already placed me on that street and done that. So I told her, and as it turns out, the lady who randomly came up to me at the fair was also the lady that called in his suicide to the police that were 3 blocks away. And she just randomly freaking found me on a street fair in Denver, and it's a huge street fair. It was a huge street fair. And so that was another one of those signs where you just are like, how could that even freaking happen? And that's exactly what happened, though. So that's just another one of those signposts on the way of craziness that helps me understand why I became a medium, and that Mike is helping me through the whole process. So I did all these classes on the East Coast. I did all that stuff. I came back. I tried to be a social worker in a nursing home, and I ended up not being able to do that because I got too busy with work, too busy with clients, and here we are. So I've taught classes. I've done all of that. I'm always striving to be a better medium. I'm always striving to help people. I definitely do a lot more than 10 readings a week now. And that is because I love this work. And people ask me at the end of the day, are you tired? Are you exhausted? Does it take anything from you? And I think I can safely say no. I think it's freaking awesome. It's my passion. It's what I absolutely love to do. And I love helping people. I always have my whole entire life. But the beautiful thing is when I'm done, I'm done. I go home, I live my life. I don't deal with spirits. I don't do any of that. People ask if I'm exhausted, and it's like, no, it's like a second day within the same day. Because it's like, when I'm done, I'm off. And in my brain, things are always happening. I'm always thinking about stuff. But I'm never really focused on that outside of my office hours of when I'm doing readings. So that is my story of how I became a medium and why I am the medium that I am now. Just for you guys who are kind of curious, I was with someone who was married and he had other kids and stuff. And over the years, that's kind of simmered down. There's no problems there. His daughter moved and her mom was there and I helped them move. And so in some ways, everything just kind of calmed down from the way it was. But I also think that it calmed down because of the people involved. Everybody that loved Mike was awesome. And everybody that loved Mike, I pretty much love them. Because of their role in his life, and I feel like he's still with me as I work, and it's just been a really beautiful experience of living life this way, because it's so empowering, and it helps other people, and I get to help other people and make a difference in their life the way someone did for me. So essentially, my journey of being a medium is me paying it forward to you guys.